The operatives of the Harpy Squad gathered in a concrete hangar on the southern edge of a secret military base. Their mission was to fly to the distant Carpathians where, according to intelligence reports, the Black Dawn group had dug in. The government had revealed prohibited experiments on living beings and the monstrous creatures these people had created in an underground complex. The order was explicit: neutralize the laboratory and destroy all evidence of its activities. The captain led the squad. He appeared to be a tall man in his 30s, although many of the fighters understood his true age was measured in centuries. He was a Sixth Circle vampire, an alpha, and wore a large caliber pistol and a samurai sword made of silver on his belt. He rarely spoke, preferring to observe the reactions of his soldiers. He would lead them into the very heart of the mountain citadel to complete the assignment quietly, without witnesses. There were 8 other vampires in the squad. 2 belonged to the Fourth Circle, considered lower combat units, though still dangerous to ordinary humans. They kept slightly apart, whispering to each other, their demeanor betraying a certain nervousness in the presence of their elders. The remaining 5 were 5 the Circle elites, ageless and superbly trained soldiers. Among them stood a scout, accustomed to moving soundlessly like a predator in the night. Nearby was a sniper armed with a heavy rifle capable of punching through reinforced doors. 2 frontline fighters carried heavy automatic weapons loaded with explosive rounds and silver spikes. A communications specialist brought up the rear, responsible for portable transmitters and setting up complex equipment. Inside the hangar, the low hum of generators filled the air. The soldiers quickly checked their weapons. The scout tested the balance of throwing knives, fitting them to his palm. The sniper inspected his optics, which could lock onto a target from several hundred yards away. The frontline vampires carefully laid out their grenades. Everyone knew they would need to act swiftly and mercilessly. Despite the looming danger, no fear flickered across their faces. For most of them, this was routine. An intelligence officer from the human side soon arrived and briefly reiterated the mission details. He gave the coordinates of the remote facility, approximately 30 miles from the nearest settlement. There, at an altitude of over 3,000 feet, lay an old Cold War-era base. According to reports, Black Dawn operatives had been kidnapping civilians, testing serums on them, and creating hybrids capable of regenerating and rapidly adapting to extreme conditions. The government could not allow these creatures to slip out of control. The mission had 4 objectives: infiltrate undetected, destroy the laboratory blocks, eliminate any armed personnel defending the project, and ensure no samples were removed. Special attention was to be paid to any monsters created within the complex. The captain was reminded of the importance of a complete cleanup. No traces should remain pointing to any official involvement. After inspecting the black-gray helicopters, the soldiers boarded one of them, loading crates of ammunition. The powerful rotors spun up, and the metal craft lifted into the air. Beyond the armored portholes lay the night sky, where the wind roamed freely among the clouds. The captain sat slightly apart, watching his comrades and catching occasional glances. Some of the 5 D-Circle vampires looked at him with respect. Nobody wanted to ask unnecessary questions, though the new 4th E-Circle vampires furtively tried to get a look at the legendary blade on his belt. The helicopter climbed higher and headed east. The flight would take a few hours. According to the plan, it would approach the mountainous region from several miles out and then drop the squad in a ravine, from which they could silently advance on the target. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the steady vibration of the engines. Everyone understood that they would face not only mercenaries, but also artificially engineered beasts. Once the helicopter vanished into thick clouds, communication switched to a secure channel. As it cruised at top speed, the Harpy soldiers remained silent, but time dragged on, and the Carpathian ridges were still many long miles away. One of the new 4th Circle vampires, a young-looking fighter in dark tactical gear, decided to break the silence. He moved closer to 2 Circle veterans and asked a few questions about the squad's past. He wanted to understand why everyone here was so quiet and detached. One of the senior vampires, broad-shouldered, answered curtly. He said many in the squad once belonged to different clans, but fate and debts had led them to serve the government. Some had lost their patrons and sought protection from powerful lords. Others simply needed a steady income to live apart from vampire intrigues. The new vampire learned that Harpy members never shared personal tragedies too openly, because the squad followed its own rules. Anyone who started recounting old wounds often wound up reliving painful memories. The senior vampires believed it was better to keep one's emotions in check and focus on completing the mission. Glancing at the captain who sat by the bulkhead, the newcomer asked how long he had been in charge. The broad-shouldered veteran paused before replying that the captain had been fighting since the time the first gunpowder weapons were invented. When the helicopter jolted slightly, the other 4th Circle vampire, a skinny guy in a mask, spoke up. His voice trembled as he explained that he himself had been turned into a vampire as punishment by a lord of some unknown clan. He'd had no choice but to remain a helpless outcast or flee. Eventually, government agents offered him a shot at life if he agreed to serve as a soldier in a special unit. That was how he ended up here, where at least they fed him blood for risking his neck. The captain listened to this exchange without turning his head. At the mention of lords, he raised his eyebrow but said nothing. From other corners of the helicopter came brief remarks. The scout said no external factors like temperature or pressure shifts were as dangerous as the internal threats among the clans. The sniper added that the government offered more freedom than the powerful elder vampires, who could order the killing of comrades on a whim. The newcomer listened closely, gradually realizing just how perilous life outside this team could be. Everyone here was ready to die in battle because life on the outside seemed no more appealing. The captain looked out the window, lost in his own thoughts. The word Lord stirred memories of a distant past, when he was still human, fighting in the late 15th century. Around 1494, he had defended a European village from a barbarian raid. His friends fell in combat, and he himself, gravely wounded, ended up in a half-ruined church with no hope of rescue. The enemy surrounded him and executed him in front of terrified villagers. He saw how mercilessly they slaughtered the defenseless and tried to shield a little girl they planned to tear apart right in the village square. He threw himself forward despite his own wounds and immediately suffered even worse injuries. He collapsed onto the stone floor, feeling his life slip away through the gashes in his chest. In his final moments, he noticed that bullets did not harm the girl. Then her figure suddenly changed. Before him stood a being with dark wings, an adult's body, and a face lit by cold eyes. This creature tore the attackers to pieces and approached the dying man. At the time, the captain did not understand what he was seeing. His vision blurred, and his consciousness faded. Now, in the helicopter, his hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, recalling how he had once lain among corpses while chaos raged all around. Suddenly, the pilots announced that they were about 5 miles from the landing zone. The helicopter began its descent. The soldiers ended their private conversations and busied themselves with final gear checks. No one wanted to be on the ground without a full combat load. A solemn silence fell in the cabin, cutting off any further questions. Soon, they felt the vibration of the landing gear touching down on the rocky plateau. The helicopter door opened, letting the Harpy team into the cold mountain air. Night stretched out before them, damp with the chill of the high peaks. They had to travel a few hundred yards along a narrow trail to reach the abandoned entrance to the base's underground levels. Following a narrow mountain path, the Harpy squad reached the massive metal gates leading into the subterranean complex. Silence reigned, broken only by the whisper of the wind. By the light of a dim searchlight powered by an emergency generator, the vampires saw that the doors stood slightly ajar. No one emerged to confront them. The communications specialist tried to adjust his transmitter, but the static was overwhelming, as though jammers were running inside. The captain signaled, and 2-5 Circle fighters cautiously stepped over the threshold. Inside, the corridors were lit by weak, flickering lamps. The walls looked damp and battered, and the floor bore what seemed like dried bloodstains. None of it alarmed the seasoned vampires, who had witnessed countless massacres and tortures over their long lives, but they remained on guard, knowing Black Dawn might have prepared traps. One of the 4 Circle fighters followed, holding his rifle at the ready. He couldn't help asking quietly, "Could anyone here really stand against us?" The sniper, without turning, answered that the labs could harbor experiments beyond normal logic. Then he added that they should never underestimate rabid fanatics capable of using forbidden methods. The captain inspected the corridor, raising his silver sword. He remembered his own awakening centuries ago when he had barely survived mortal wounds. Then he added that they should never underestimate rabid fanatics capable of using forbidden methods. The captain inspected the corridor, raising his silver sword. He remembered his own awakening centuries ago when he had barely survived mortal wounds and was consumed by a thirst for blood. It happened in high mountain terrain. Next to him sat the winged man who had killed the barbarians, whose eyes were filled with deep sorrow. He had looked at the captain and spoken words the captain would never forget. There is only one rule in nature: eat or be eaten. It's foolish to sacrifice yourself for the lives of others, though I did like that village. Then this strange winged man vanished, leaving him alone amid the grim peaks. Later, he encountered other immortals who explained the strict hierarchy of the vampire world. They spoke of the earliest circles. Weak, mindless ghouls who often died without regular feeding or from old age, though they could live far longer than humans. They mentioned the second circle, slightly tougher but still dependent on blood and vulnerable to heavy weaponry, swords, and axes. They talked of the third circle, a complete vampire but doomed to mortality without constant replenishment of strength. If they failed to drink blood, they would wither over centuries and die. Then came the fourth circle, combat vampires capable of entering a dormant state when deprived of food and reviving with the first drop of blood. Yet these too were vulnerable to silver and sunlight, just like circles 1, 2, and 3. They described the fifth circle, elite soldiers who could regenerate from serious injuries, even if decapitated, and who did not burn under the sun. Still, they remained susceptible to silver weapons, which certain highly skilled humans could use to dismember or burn them. Finally, they spoke of the sixth circle, alphas, far too resilient for ordinary killing methods. Even if 5 the circle vampires attacked them with silver weapons, they could not inflict any real harm. Legends claimed they could only be killed by other sixth circle vampires or by the higher seventh circle lords. The captain knew he belonged to that tier but avoided proclaiming his status, afraid that the seventh circle lords might take an interest in his existence. In those days, he learned of the seventh circle, home to ancient lords who ruled entire clans. They were virtually impossible to destroy, immune to sunlight and silver or any other weapon. They could go centuries without blood or sustenance, never weakening. They could only be killed by their own kind or by eighth circle vampires. The eighth circle remained the stuff of legend, vampire gods like Dracula or Lilith, who could exist forever and mold the world as they saw fit. Rumor also spoke of a mysterious, legendary Dark, supposedly the very first vampire, unknown to humanity, and regarded by vampires themselves as a mythical being. While traveling across continents, the captain discovered a rare gift. He absorbed a portion of the power of fallen foes if they were stronger than average. Through this, he had evolved from an ordinary 4th circle vampire to a true 5th, and later ascended to alpha status, the 6th circle. That path was perilous. Some vampires, upon learning of his ability, tried to destroy him to preserve the balance. His gift was a threat to the ancient hierarchy. It undermined a system thousands of years old, and the lords would not allow it. Perhaps there were others like him, with the same rare power, but they, too, were hunted. He faked his death, went into hiding, and lived as a mercenary before joining the government's special unit, where his skill in taking down particularly dangerous monsters was highly valued. He needed that work to keep growing. He saw no other way to fight dangerous creatures. Now, walking down the corridor, the captain showed no outward concern, though within he felt a faint tension mingled with anticipation. Spotting scattered ammunition on the floor, he realized a battle had taken place here. It seemed that some members of Black Dawn or their guards had already fought someone, or something stronger than ordinary mercenaries. The silence and the congealed bloodstains hinted at a confrontation with inhuman beasts. The team reached their first terminal, where a smashed control panel flickered. The scout tried to restore power, but could only retrieve fragments of encrypted files. A few frames began to play on the crackling screen. They showed people in white lab coats running out of the laboratories, chased by dark silhouettes with wolf-like features. The captain noticed these creatures were taller than most humans. Moving quick, a few hushed remarks spread through the vampires, but they were cut short by a crunching noise in a side tunnel. All weapons swung toward it, and a few seconds later, An older man with disheveled gray hair and a blood-stained lab coat emerged. He raised his hands, squinting under the bright beams of their flashlights. When the captain approached, the man introduced himself as Dr. Kraus. His voice trembled with a rasping whisper. He said the Black Dawn mercenaries had forced him to work on genetic experiments. He mentioned that somewhere deep in the facility were hybrid specimens with special abilities. Then, in a shaking tone, he added that among the test subjects was a genuine werewolf, used as the donor for a series of horrific creations. When the captain replied that the government had ordered everything destroyed, Kraus went even paler. He understood that an extermination team had arrived and was clearly afraid for his own skin. Yet he offered to guide them, pleading for his life. If they succeeded, he would share all the data. The captain gave a curt nod, then glanced at his fighters. They would have to advance deeper into the restricted sectors to wipe out every last specimen. Dr. Kraus led the group through bent steel doors, running his hand along the walls as though searching for familiar landmarks. He explained that the complex's power system had been damaged by an uncontrolled surge caused by the experiments. The captain listened in silence, trying not to miss a single sound. A harsh odor of burning and stale blood permeated the corridors. In some places they came across scorched devices and torn cables. The squad reached a spacious elevator shaft. The car was stuck somewhere up above. Dr. Kraus suggested they would have to climb down the auxiliary ladders. But suddenly the lights flickered and the hall rang with the crackle of a short circuit. Somewhere ahead came a sharp howl, like the cry of a beast that had broken free to hunt. The vampires gripped their weapons, peering into the shadows, but saw no one. It was clear the werewolf hybrids were nearby. Contact with the surface went dead for good. The communication specialist cursed, fiddling with the receiver, but the interference drowned out every frequency. They had no choice but to move deeper without hope of calling for backup. The Eighth Circle newcomer walked alongside the scout, clutching the cold railing that led down into the shaft. 2 5th Circle fighters covered the flanks. The captain carried his pistol at the ready, keeping his sword slung behind him. When they descended about 40 feet, they reached a metal platform. 2 corridors branched out from there. The scout quickly inspected a side door, where dim lighting revealed something resembling an anatomy block. The floor was covered in brownish stains of dried blood, and ripped-out piping dangled from the walls. The air felt heavy and unpleasant. The captain signaled for them to split into 2 groups to search both passages. The first group, consisting of the scout and one of the frontline fighters, disappeared down the side corridor. The captain led the others in the opposite direction. Kraus stayed closer to the middle, constantly glancing around. In a hushed voice, he kept muttering that Black Dawn were mad fanatics. Just then, the group heard noise coming from the direction of the elevator shaft. There was a crash, followed by a scream and a burst of automatic gunfire. Judging by the clamor, the scout and the frontline fighter had engaged in combat. The captain ordered everyone to rush back to the platform, but when they arrived, the shaft was empty. Only scraps of uniform lay on the floor, and fresh blood ran in crimson streaks down the walls. Spotting a vague hybrid figure in the distance, the vampires opened fire. Bullets tore into metal and concrete, but the creature vanished into the darkness, letting out a chilling growl as it fled. Its cry echoed through the corridors, making it clear there was more than one. Kraus clung desperately to the wall, sweat streaming down his face. He repeated that they had to reach the central sector, where the main destruction terminal was located. Through that terminal, they could initiate an emergency deactivation and trigger the reactor's self-destruct, burying all lab blocks underground. The captain nodded, deciding a large-scale explosion might solve the problem if they couldn't handle the monsters on their own. They moved on until they came to a set of huge steel gates. The mechanism had jammed, so they were forced to use explosives. A pair of heavy charges went off with a deafening boom, spraying the corridor with debris. When the smoke cleared, a spacious laboratory came into view, filled with racks of vials and test tubes. Broken furniture, smashed equipment, and remnants of what might have been someone's uniform lay everywhere. Deep scratches lined the floor. The sniper checked the left flank, trying to spot movement behind the glass partitions. Suddenly there was a dull thud, and two creatures emerged from behind toppled structures. Their silhouettes were distorted. Human bodies with distinct wolfish features, snarling muzzles and massive paws tipped with claws that gleamed like polished metal. The captain raised his pistol and fired, aiming between the eyes of the closest hybrid. The round hit home with a loud crack, but the creature only growled and lunged forward. The other vampires unleashed a barrage of gunfire, tearing through walls and equipment with explosive rounds. One werewolf went down when the sniper planted a specially charged bullet in its throat, ripping off its upper body. The second nearly reached the communications specialist, but the captain reacted in time, slashing with his sword. The blade cut into the hybrid's side, slicing through bone. The beast convulsed, eyes rolling, and collapsed to the floor. A second later, its limbs twitched, then fell limp. Everything went quiet, though distant clangs and creaks hinted that more of these monsters were roaming the corridors. The captain noticed that the fourth circle newcomer had received a deep wound on his arm during the brief skirmish. He stood there, stifling a groan, trying to heal the shredded tissue. The sniper approached to help bandage the wound, while the doctor looked on from a distance, unwilling to come any closer. It seemed the hybrids understood exactly how to strike vampires, using their regenerative abilities just as skillfully. Examining the dead werewolves, the captain noticed their claws looked unusual, coated in metal. Dr. Krause, voice shaking, explained that Black Dawn had tried to create hybrids that went beyond simple wolf genes. The scientists were ordered to incorporate silver implants into the werewolves' claws to make them lethal. Moreover, these creatures regenerated quickly, feeding on any protein source they could find. Their fangs contained some unknown toxic venom. Looking at the newcomer's bloodied arm, the captain saw how severe the wound was. Shards of bone protruded from torn flesh, and the healing process was slow. The venom appeared to be hindering regeneration. Kraus hastily offered a few capsules from a surviving medical kit. Pills meant to temporarily block the beast's toxin. The 4 EA Circle vampire took them, hoping it would slow the tissue damage. Dr. Kraus asked the captain for a couple of minutes to find additional supplies in the lab. While Krause rummaged through the shattered cabinets and tables, several fighters examined the corridors beyond. They stumbled on warped metal beams and shards of broken vials. No one could tell what was splashing around in these spilled substances. The air smelled of scorched flesh and stale chemicals, their footsteps echoing ominously. The captain and 2 5th Circle vampires approached a reinforced door lit by a red warning light. A sign on the wall indicated that high-value specimens were kept beyond it. Suddenly, they heard soft steps in the corridor a few yards behind them. Spinning around, they saw 3 hybrids. These ones appeared thinner and more agile, moving almost soundlessly. One of the werewolves stepped forward, its claws gleaming with a silvery sheen. The vampires opened fire. Bullets gouged the walls, blasting chunks of concrete. 2 of the creatures rushed straight at them, ignoring their wounds. The third crouched and slid to the side, trying to flank them. One of the frontline fighters tossed a grenade, which detonated right beneath the closest hybrid's feet. The blast shredded its body, painting the walls with red gore. The second beast took several hits to the chest, but kept snarling, slashing the air with its claws, and tried to grab one of the soldiers. Only a barrage of rounds, which tore through its ribs with a crack, finally put it down. The captain whirled around just in time to see the third hybrid attacking the remaining 4th Circle vampire, who still hadn't recovered from his previous injury. The werewolf pounced, knocking him to the ground, sinking its fangs into his neck. He managed to get off a point-blank shot, but the beast's claws had already punctured his chest. The sound of bones snapping filled the air, cutting through the muffled chaos. The soldier fell silent, and the hybrid jerked its head violently, tearing away a fragment of the victim's throat. The others immediately opened fire, riddling the monster with bullets. It tried to lurch away, but the wounds were too severe to regenerate. The werewolf collapsed, convulsing, its blood mixing with shards of broken glass. Thus the 4th Circle newcomer died before he could finish healing from his earlier injuries. The captain frowned, surveying the young vampire's remains. His face was frozen in a final scream, his neck a torn wound. Dr. Kraus, returning with sample reading plates, froze in place for a moment, dropping the box. He hadn't expected the hybrids to break through bullets and grenades so easily. Soon, the squad cleared away the debris and pressed on. 2 of the 5th Circle vampires supported a wounded comrade who had managed to survive. The route to the central sector led through several corridors laid with steel tiles, the walls painted with warning signs about high-level biological hazards. Traces of battle were everywhere. The captain noticed torn helmets from unknown fighters and spent shells scattered across the floor. Ahead lay the thick doors leading to the central halls. The captain ordered everyone to be ready for an ambush. He recalled Dr. Kraus's mention of main specimens, presumably even stronger and more intelligent hybrids. It occurred to the captain that the monster's claws were coated with a thin layer of silver, and their fangs dripped with a toxin that interfered with vampire regeneration. Someone had deliberately bred these creatures to kill vampires. The rusty corridors stretched forward for dozens of yards, tunneling deeper into the underground complex. Feeling their way past flickering lights, the harpy vampires tried to stick together. After what they had encountered in the previous sections, they understood they had underestimated how quickly these abominations could strike. The remaining 5th Circle frontline fighters cast wary glances at the darkened doorways. The air reeked of chemical reagents mingled with the metallic tang of blood. The last surviving fourth circle vampire, who was wounded as well, walked beside one of the 5 eighth circle veterans. His arm, hastily wrapped with whatever bandages they could find, throbbed with pain at every step. The capsules blocking some of the toxin had helped only slightly, slowing but not halting the tissue destruction. Still, he complained little. It took all his willpower just to keep going. The memory of his comrade's death was still fresh in everyone's minds. The 6th circle captain led the way, gripping the hilt of his silver sword. Dr. Krauss stayed near the back, constantly looking toward the ceiling, afraid the predators might drop down from above. Before long, the corridor opened into a wide area surrounded by massive tanks, leaking some strange fluid. Now the corroded valves hissed loudly, occasionally spewing harmful fumes into the air. In the center of the space were twisted support beams, lying like broken crutches on the splattered floor. Faint, flickering lights cast uneven patches of illumination. The squad moved forward, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Yet their footsteps echoed, and somewhere above them came the scrape of claws. Soon, a wolfish howl rang out from above, as though calling the rest of the pack to attack. The vampires exchanged glances, weapons ready. That very moment, dark shapes emerged from behind the nearest tanks. They moved silently, creeping up on the Harpy team from different angles, their claws shimmering with metallic glints in the dim light. The first to attack was a hulking hybrid, leaping for a 5th circle veteran. Its silver claws tore through his uniform. The veteran tried to fire an explosive round into the beast, but the werewolf slammed him in the head, flinging him several feet away. The 4th circle vampire instinctively rushed in, aiming his rifle at the creature's chest. But another hybrid burst out from the side, clamping onto his elbow and pinning him to the ground. The silver claw drove through his arm and flesh while fangs sank into his head. The sound of strangled choking was followed by a sickening crunch. His breathing stopped in a single horrific instant. A moment later, yet another hybrid pounced on the fallen 5F circle soldier, who hadn't managed to stand after the previous blow. The massive wolf-like body crushed him against the floor, splintering ribs. A muffled groan escaped him. Then, with a savage bite, the monster snapped his vertebrae in a grisly crack, like a dry branch underfoot. The 5th circle soldier's body went limp, and the beast buried its fangs even deeper, as though trying to drain every last drop. The remaining Harpy fighters responded with a hail of gunfire. Several hybrids dropped, ripped apart by grenades. But 4 wolves kept up the assault. 2 charged deeper into the chamber, looking for someone to isolate from the group, while another pair rushed the captain. The alpha vampire hacked through one monster's claws and parried a second strike, then slashed his silver sword across the attacker's skull, splitting bone. The stunned creature wobbled and sank to its knees. Its regeneration couldn't handle such a wound, and it went still. Yet the surviving hybrids, seeing their comrade's blood, roared even louder, as though absorbing the other's fury. The captain noticed 2 of them bending over the bodies of their fallen kin and the slain vampires. They lowered their heads to the wounds, sinking their fangs into the flesh. It looked like some feral feeding ritual. Their muscles bulged, and their eyes blazed with renewed rage. Their wounds sealed before his eyes. After a few more gunshots, the noise died away. Those hybrids still capable of movement retreated into the gaps between the tanks before the vampires could unleash heavy fire. Left behind on the floor were the torn bodies of 2 harpy fighters. One more 4th circle and one experienced 5th circle. The survivors were breathing hard, scanning the half-lit chamber. Their ranks were thinning, and these monsters displayed terrifying strength. Dr. Kraus stood pressed against a wall, his head drawn into his shoulders in fear. The captain lowered his sword, glancing at the remaining vampires out of the corner of his eye. They were wounded, but still on their feet. The sniper, crouched behind a fallen pipe, was checking his rifle's magazine, while the communications specialist lay nearby, pressing a hand against his shattered headset. Apparently, the main unit had been destroyed during the firefight. In this uneven struggle, Harpy had lost 2 more soldiers. Dr. Kraus whispered urgently that they had to destroy the central sector as soon as possible, because deeper in the lab were creatures far worse than what they had already faced. The remaining fighters knew there was no turning back. No help would come from the surface. They regrouped and pushed on through the clouds of steam, twisted tanks, and pools of blood from which the ghastly remains of hybrids rose. Suddenly, the air filled with a heavy growl. There was a rumbling in the corridors, as though a huge pack of living creatures was approaching from all sides. The vampires felt the floor tremble faintly under their boots. Above them came the pounding of footsteps. From the right-hand passages echoed the snarling voices of more hybrids. The captain raised his sword, casting a quick glance at Kraus, who looked terrified, pressed against the wall. The first wolves appeared out of nowhere. 3 massive creatures charging into the corridor lit by red emergency lights. Their labored breathing pounded like hammer blows on steel. One werewolf's silver claws left deep gouges in the floor. Another leapt forward, attempting to sink its fangs into the nearest 5th circle fighter, but the soldier fired a shattering round that blasted part of the monster's jaw clean off. The werewolf howled, reeling back and dragging along broken, sizzling fragments. Then 5 more wolves attacked from behind, tightening the circle around the squad. 2 vampires unleashed a torrent of bullets and hurled explosive grenades. The narrow corridor filled with the roar of blasts, bursts of fire, and thick clouds of smoke. Still, the hybrids did not relent. One of the monsters nearly reached the sniper before collapsing with a bullet through its skull. He managed a killing shot just in time. But as he tried to line up another target, a second werewolf tackled him, darting along the wall. The sound of plastic and metal splintering drowned out the vampire's shouts. 6 hybrids managed to strike from the flanks, ripping the defensive line apart. They tore into the squad, separating the soldiers. The captain found himself fending off a series of brutal attacks from an enormous werewolf, much larger than the ones they had faced before. Every claw sliced through the air, trying to tear the vampire apart. One swipe from the monster smashed a chunk of concrete behind him. The alpha vampire dodged, drove his blade into the beast's side, and yanked it back out, releasing a spurt of black fluid. The creature roared in fury and leapt again, showing no trace of fear. The other werewolves swarmed toward the most vulnerable fighters. The communications specialist, unable to get away in time, was struck by a barrage of claws. His chest split open, and his equipment shattered against a steel beam. One of the 5D circle vampires intercepted the next blow, firing several explosive rounds and managing to put one wolf down. But two others immediately dragged him to the ground, snapping his bones. The sniper tried to maintain distance, yet the hybrids overpowered him, pinning him against a partition. Sizzling fangs bit into his neck, exposing the crunch of bone. The captain fought the giant werewolf, doing his best to save what remained of the squad. His silver sword slashed through the air, leaving deep gashes in the wolf's hide, but those wounds healed quickly. The toxin in the enemy's claws had already seeped into the vampire's injuries, slowing his regeneration. He knew he wouldn't last long unless he ended the fight with a single decisive strike. Suddenly the beast vaulted up, pushing off a wall to crash down on the captain from above. Timing his move, the vampire drove his blade straight into the creature's neck. The werewolf hissed, jerked, and fell hard to its knees. The vampire twisted the blade, trying to deliver a mortal wound. The werewolf went still, slumping to one side. The captain caught his breath only to realize that chaos reigned all around. 3 wolves, their muzzles already smeared with blood, were finishing off 2 5-the-circle vampires, while another pair lurked in the smoke, mauling those who tried to crawl away. Some of the vampires managed to fire their last rounds before the werewolves finally tore their bodies apart. 2 surviving 5-circle fighters, still alive, screamed in agony as their limbs were ripped off. The toxin soaked into those gory stumps, blocking their regeneration. The captain wanted to intervene, but his own wounds left him barely able to move. He felt the numbing effect spreading through his body. The werewolves surrounded him, growling and sniffing loudly. They could not dismember him. Their claws touched his flesh, carving deep ruts. But they couldn't tear the alpha apart, as though the metal simply couldn't handle his bones. The vampire pretended to lose consciousness, collapsing beside the dead wolf he had slain. That was enough for one of the hybrids, who grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. The others helped drag him along the corridor. The toxin prevented his regeneration from working properly, so he barely resisted. Dr. Kraus had also been taken prisoner, held by 2 werewolves to keep him from escaping. The captain saw this in his peripheral vision, continuing to feign heavy injury. He needed a chance to get close to whoever was behind these creatures. An open fight would mean immediate death. At last the hybrids hauled their captives into a vast chamber that looked like an arena. High above, powerful floodlights flickered, and dark puddles lay across the floor. Twisted pipes, grates, and metal barriers were scattered everywhere. A large crowd of werewolves had gathered, a tight knot of them snarling and jostling each other. A fierce skirmish broke out among them on some bestial, instinctive level. They tugged at the prisoners' limbs, biting their shoulders and tearing off scraps of gear. But they left the captain mostly intact. Perhaps they were waiting for the one who gave them orders. Suddenly, infighting broke out in the pack. One werewolf sank its fangs into another's neck, ripping off a chunk of flesh and tossing it aside. Its victim dropped instantly, letting out a cloud of steam from its torn throat. The other werewolves growled, shifting uneasily, but none dared attack the killer. He bared his teeth, making it clear he was ready to slaughter anyone who challenged him. 2 of the 5-the-circle vampires, missing arms and legs, lay helpless on the blood-soaked floor. Their attempts at regeneration were thwarted by the same paralyzing toxin. They couldn't move. and the gigantic wolves shoved them aside in disgust, watching as whatever sparks of life pulsed in their stumps began to fade. The vampire's screams ebbed into weak moans. The captain struggled to hide his rage, doing his best not to give himself away. He was the only one among the captives still mostly in one piece, but his wounds prevented any decisive action. A snarl came from above, and an enormous werewolf appeared on a raised platform. Its fur shimmered with a matte black sheen, and jagged spikes jutted along its back. It was immediately clear that this was no ordinary hybrid, but something far greater than the giant the captain had killed earlier. The beast fixed him with yellow eyes and spoke in a low, human voice, a rasping whisper. He repeated, "The Great Father said, 'Eat or be eaten. Only the victor claims power.'" All the other wolves lowered their heads. The beast turned to the captain, pointed a massive paw, and announced it would take all of his energy. A surge of tension flared inside the alpha vampire. He realized this werewolf possessed the ability to absorb powers, much like his own rare gift. This confrontation would be the most dangerous battle he had faced in centuries. The pack drew back, growling low, ready to unleash violence at any false move. Dr. Krause stood off to the side, watching grimly. By now, the captain was sure that the talking hybrid was capable of unleashing unimaginable havoc on the vampire world if not stopped. He also thought if he could destroy it, he might absorb its energy and move closer to the seventh circle himself. The rest of the pack formed a ring around what looked like a makeshift arena where they tossed the wounded vampires. Summoning all the strength he had left, the captain forced himself to his feet, aware that everything depended on this fight. Behind him, the surviving harpy vampires groaned, but no one was able to help. 2-5 the circles with severed limbs lay nearby, quietly bleeding out, their only sounds reduced to ragged gasps. The talking werewolf took a lumbering step, looking the captain over. Its eyes, devoid of human mercy, locked onto him as though weighing whether the alpha could still fight back. The captain bent his knees slightly, drawing his sword in front of him. The toxin still hindered his healing, but there would be no second chance. The beast crouched, flinging its forelimbs out in a sudden lunge. The clang of claws scraping metal was ominous. Their opening clash erupted with raw force. The werewolf struck from the left, and the captain barely managed to intercept with his blade, sparks flying. Pain ignited in his arms as the steel vibrated under impact, but he countered, slashing the beast's right flank. It recoiled, blood flowing from a ragged wound, its eyes blazing with furious light. The blood dripping onto the floor caused several wolves in the crowd to howl menacingly, stirred by the smell. The captain dashed forward, hoping to seize the momentum. He unleashed a flurry of blows, aiming to shatter the creature's vital organs. One thrust struck home in its rib cage, but the beast shoved the blade aside with its forearm. The silver edge bit deeply into the bone, yet the werewolf pulled its limb free and darted back, suppressing its pain with a vicious snarl. Then it lunged at the captain, claws arcing overhead. The alpha vampire couldn't fully dodge. Sharp steel grazed his ribs and blood spattered his tattered uniform. For several minutes, the fight raged in a blur of swings, quick feints, and glaring bursts of force. The watching pack remained eerily silent, waiting to see who would prevail. Despite numerous wounds, the werewolf showed no sign of weakening, its regeneration working fast. The captain felt the toxin inside him continuing to eat away at his muscles, He knew he had to finish it with a single precise maneuver. Gathering his last reserves of strength, he lured the beast toward a twisted metal barrier, forcing it into an awkward angle. His moment came when the werewolf tried to strike down from above. Ducking low, the captain slid beneath its paws and drove his blade deep into the left side of its chest, where he believed the heart to be. The sword pierced cartilage and bone with a dull, wet sound. The werewolf choked, and a torrent of blood soaked its forelegs. The alpha vampire shoved harder, ripping further into muscle. The creature froze, toppled onto its side, and its eyes dulled. The vampire followed through, hacking the werewolf to pieces and absorbing its energy. The pack began to stir, their fur bristling, yet none immediately dared attack the captain. After felling the monster, the vampire saw that some of the surviving 5 the circles were beginning to regrow their limbs. Without constant feeding, the process was slow, but there were faint signs of regeneration. Then, within mere seconds, that fragile respite shattered. Enraged by the death of their strongest wolf, the pack descended on the fallen vampires. In seconds, the crowd of beasts tore them apart, drenching the wrecked metal around them with blood. The captain tried to intervene, but was immediately mobbed by several more hybrids. Their fury was merciless. He parried claws, slipping on the slick, gore-soaked floor. After the grueling fight with their leader, he had little strength left to face the entire pack. One werewolf clamped down on his side, another ripped open his already injured back. The alpha vampire fought to the end, managing to kill 2 wolves with his sword. But the rest kept coming. They surrounded him, swarming and driving him to the ground. Snarling jaws and claws tore through his body armor, leaving bloody slashes on his skin. Searching desperately for an escape, the captain spotted Dr. Kraus. Surprisingly, the doctor didn't appear afraid. Even at the heart of the slaughter, he made no attempt to hide. Nor did the hybrids tear into him as they had the other captives. It was puzzling. The alpha vampire wanted to shout for Kraus to flee, but froze when he saw the doctor's strangely calm stare. The werewolves closed ranks around the captain. He felt doomed. His wounds throbbed, poison seeping deeper, choking off any chance of regeneration. As the wolves' frenzy peaked, the captain tried to break free, only to be hurled against a heap of shattered crates. The monsters blocked the corridor, clawing at the walls to keep him from slipping away. There was no escape. All he could do was keep fending off fangs and claws until the last of his strength ran out. He watched a hybrid dart up to Kraus, almost as if trying to confirm his allegiance. But Kraus merely raised an eyebrow, and the werewolf backed away. Unease flickered within the captain. The pieces clicked into place. Kraus was no mere victim. Perhaps everything that had happened was part of a deeper plot. Dr. Kraus returned the captain's gaze and, revealing his true intent, tore off his blood-stained lab coat. Underneath lay a mesh of scars across his torso and evidence of once-healed wings. Then he tilted his head back, and 2 leathery forms began unfolding from his shoulders, resembling the wings of a giant bat. The hybrids nearby let out a muffled howl, stepping back and lowering their muzzles to the floor. Their reaction made clear that Krause held a special status among these beasts. Pinned against broken shards of metal by the pack's claws, the captain managed to lift his head. He realized that Krause was not just another werewolf. He was something far more powerful and ancient. That explained why he wasn't afraid. and why the hybrids didn't tear him apart. The outlines of Krause's body began to shift. Fur sprouted on his arms and chest, while the fully formed wings spread wide. His fur, silver black, gleamed under the cracked overhead lights, and his eyes glowed with a cold radiance. The wolves formed a perimeter, bowing low and not daring to approach him. The doctor gave a rough laugh, pointing a clawed hand at the captain. A memory surfaced in the vampire's mind. Long ago, when he had been turned by a mysterious winged man. But this time, there was no trace of compassion or a rescue. The creature's face showed only cruelty. "You've entertained me, young vampire. Accept my gift, my name. I am the firstborn. Pleased to meet you, Captain." Krause snarled through a gaping maw. An overpowering aura radiated from him. Nearby hybrids thumped the floor with their paws in reverence. Even the largest werewolves that had just been ripping up corpses slunk back, howling. The captain went still for an instant, sensing this being could annihilate him with a single gesture. The firstborn werewolf called himself the father of all werewolves, saying he had created them on a whim. A wicked grin stretched across the doctor's muzzle. He stared at the captain in mocking amusement, as if daring him to resist. The alpha vampire gritted his teeth, realizing his foe's power likely surpassed any Seven the Circle vampire lord's abilities, which he barely understood to begin with. Yet instead of fear, he felt a surge of fury. Fury for the slaughter of his comrades, for the limbs torn away, for the betrayal orchestrated by Krause. "I smell the Dark One's blood," the firstborn growled, cocking his head. "So your potential is limitless, but it won't save you from me." He extended a condescending invitation to play, casually flicking a deadly claw in the vampire's direction. The captain, refusing to show weakness, lunged forward, aiming his sword straight at the beast's chest. Their fight erupted almost instantly, the hybrids closing in around the arena to keep their distance. Blasts of force echoed throughout the chamber as both combatants exchanged lightning-fast blows. They moved so quickly that the air seemed to crackle whenever metal clashed with bone. The captain seized an opening when the werewolf's flank was momentarily exposed, and he drove his blade in deep, right at the heart. A crimson surge flooded the floor. All the hybrids fell silent. The doctor froze, apparently stunned. For a moment, the vampire thought this might be his chance to survive. But the firstborn werewolf tore the sword from his chest and with a laugh crushed the blade between his jaws, as though it were a fragile stone, as if it were nothing more than a snack. Then he swung his forelimbs with such blinding speed that, in a single motion, he severed the alpha's arms and legs. The captain toppled, blood gushing, certain he was beyond saving. The firstborn leaned down to sniff his immobilized victim. He laughed again, louder, declaring that no one had ever managed even to scratch him before, and that he was delighted to meet such a tenacious descendant of the Dark One. The monster said he would be sure to pass this story along to his own brother, the legendary Dark, praising him for producing such a powerful offspring. The vampire hissed through frayed vocal cords, trying to endure the pain. But the creature straightened up and stepped over the dismembered limbs, taking on human form again, now that of a young man, eerily similar to the one who had once turned the alpha vampire. The man picked up a syringe of serum and injected it into the vampire's neck. He laughed again, calling it a small prank on his brother. A scorching sensation tore through every cell of the captain's body. The sound of his own scream merged with the firstborn's hideous laughter. Darkness overwhelmed him, and the final images burned into his memory were mangled corpses and the gleam of the beast's fur. When the captain regained consciousness, he was in a dark chamber, the cold walls pressing in. His arms and legs had regenerated, but were now pinned to the stone by huge silver spikes. 3 more spikes pierced his chest. Each spike seeped toxic venom through his flesh, halting any attempt at healing. Massive chains bound his torso, allowing only the bare minimum of breath. A single dim lamp glowed overhead, casting murky shadows. Standing nearby were 4 vampires emitting an aura of staggering power. Judging by the oppressive sensation, they were 6th Circle vampires like him, ready to strike at the slightest hint of rebellion. They regarded the captive grimly, gripping long spears inscribed with symbols designed for killing vampires. The captain recalled the moment when the firstborn werewolf had injected him with that serum. His head pounded as though everything inside was boiling. At the far end of the chamber, a heavy door opened. A woman with fine features and indifferent eyes stepped in. She moved past the guards and sat on a metal chair facing the captain. The energy radiating from her belonged only to the 7th Circle. She examined the silver spikes lodged in his body with a mocking smile. Her calm demeanor betrayed the presence of a higher being. "What gift did the firstborn werewolf leave you?" she asked, her voice low and measured. The captain couldn't answer immediately. His throat ached, and his muscles refused to obey. She studied him with interest, as though he were a new specimen for her private collection. The 4 6th Circle guards raised their spears. One made a quick motion, threatening to kill the prisoner if he tried anything. The captain tried to move his hand, but the silver shredded his nerves, and a wave of pain made him clamp his eyes shut. The vampire lord smirked and leaned forward, reminding him that he couldn't escape without her permission. The alpha vampire realized he was deep in a sanctuary belonging to the higher vampires. His fate now lay in their hands. He wanted to break free, but his strength was gone, and whatever the new serum was, it might be volatile, a mutation or a curse. "We watched what happened in the lab," the woman continued, standing up from the chair. "We know about your fight with the firstborn." She mentioned the legendary Dark and the werewolf's brother. Her voice was devoid of emotion, as if speaking about the weather. 3 of the guards exchanged glances. One left the room, leaving the door partly open. The captain tried to ask what they intended to do, but his words refused to form. The silver in his bloodstream paralyzed his vocal cords. The vampire lord tilted her head, studying his wounds. He suspected the lords were waiting to see how the serum might affect him, hoping to observe any changes. Perhaps they planned to use him as a test subject. Hopelessness overwhelmed him. He could see no path to freedom. All he had left were the firstborn's parting words and the faint hope that a hidden chance might arise somewhere in this twisted plot. Inside him, fury raged alongside exhaustion. The 7th Circle Lord exited the chamber, tossing out a final question. "Will you become our weapon against our true enemy? Who is that?" The captain managed to croak through his pain. The woman hesitated for a moment, then said, "Our father, the legendary Dark." And with that she was gone. The guards remained ready to impale the alpha at any moment.